The morning my daughter called to tell me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a colander full of green beans. I remember that detail so clearly. The colander, the beans, the way the water ran cold over my fingers while her voice came through the phone, measured and careful, like she'd practiced the words in a mirror. Mom, we've decided to do things a little differently this year. It's just going to be us and Scott's family. I think it'll be less stressful for everyone. Less stressful for everyone. I turned off the faucet. I set the colander on the dish rack. I say, see, and she said, I knew you'd understand. And then she was gone, and I stood in my kitchen in the November quiet and looked at the green beans dripping into the basin. I had bought them that morning. I had driven to the farmer's market 3 towns over because I knew my daughter liked the skinny French ones, the haricots verts, not the fat grocery store kind. I had been planning Thanksgiving in my head for 6 weeks. I had already ordered the pie. I canceled the pie. I ate the green beans alone over 2 days. And I told myself it was fine. That was 3 years ago. I know now that it was not fine. But at the time, I was still the woman who made herself small to fit into whatever space her family allowed her. I had been practicing that particular art form for the better part of a decade, and I had gotten very good at it. My daughter's name is Vivienne. No, I'll call her something else, something that doesn't catch in my throat the same way. I'll call her what she started to feel like to me in those years. A stranger I used to know by heart. Her husband, I'll call him Scott, came into our lives when my daughter was 32. I liked him at first. He was the kind of man who shook your hand firmly and remembered your birthday the first year and forgot it every year after that. He called me by my first name from the start, before I'd offered it, and at the time I thought that meant warmth. I understand now it meant something else entirely. They married quickly. Within 14 months of meeting, they were standing in a garden I had helped pay for, under an arch of white roses I had helped choose, and I danced with my daughter and thought, this is it. This is the beginning of a new and larger life. I had no idea it was the beginning of a smaller one. My late husband, Gene, had passed 4 years before the wedding. Brain bleed, sudden, no warning. He was out in the yard raking leaves, and then he was on the ground. And then 9 days later, he was gone. We had been married 38 years. I want you to understand what that means. 38 years is not a number. It is every morning. It is the sound of someone else's breathing in the dark. It is every ordinary Tuesday that you never thought to memorize because you assumed there would be more. After Jean died, I was not myself for a long time. I'm not sure I was anyone in particular. I moved through the house and made coffee and answered mail, and at some point the grief softened enough that I could feel the loneliness underneath it, which was in some ways harder. My daughter was my tether. She called every Sunday. She visited on holidays. When she met Scott, those calls got a little shorter, but I understood. New love takes up space. I gave her the space. When she got pregnant, I genuinely thought that we were coming back to each other, that the baby would be a bridge. I drove up to be with her for the last month of her pregnancy. I slept on the guest room bed with the floral comforter that Scott had picked out, and I didn't say a word about how it wasn't quite right for the room. I cooked, I organized. I was useful and quiet and careful not to take up too much air. My granddaughter was born on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 pounds, 11 ounces. A full head of dark hair. When they put her in my arms in the recovery room, I thought my heart would split clean open from the love of it. I didn't know that baby was about to be used as a lever. It started so gradually that I couldn't point to the moment it began. A comment from Scott about how I was always just dropping by. A rearranged holiday schedule that always seemed to put Jean's side of the family at the edge of the table and Scott's family at the center. A suggestion, gentle at first, that I might want to let them find their own rhythm as parents. And then the asks. I want to be honest about this part, because I've heard from other women in my situation, and sometimes we leave this part out. We were not always purely victims. I was a woman who wanted to be needed, who had built her entire identity around being useful. When my daughter asked me for help, real help, money help, I said yes so fast it must have looked like eagerness. Because it was. The first time was the car. Their sedan had died, and they needed something reliable for the baby. And could I help with the down payment? $8,000. I transferred it before I even hung up the phone. Then it was the furnace. Then it was a gap between paychecks that stretched longer than expected. Then it was the backyard fence. They wanted a proper fence before my granddaughter started walking. Each time I said yes. Each time I felt the warm flush of being necessary. Each time I told myself, this is what family does. What I did not notice, or what I noticed and refused to fully see, was that the asks came reliably, but the invitations did not. I could fund the fence, but I was not invited to see it installed. I helped buy the car but was never asked on the road trip they took that summer. My granddaughter turned 1 year old and I received a photo, not a phone call. And when I mentioned this to my daughter, she said, very quietly, that they were trying to keep things low-key. She had been trying to keep things low-key for about 2 years by the time the Thanksgiving call came. After that call, something in me began to wake up. Not all at once. More like a plant that's been in a dark room and you move it. Finally, 3 inches toward the window. The change is invisible at first. But it's happening. I started paying attention. Not to what my daughter said, but to the pattern of what she said. The asks were consistent. The access was not. She called when they needed something. She kept things low-key when they didn't. I am 67 years old. I taught 4th grade for 26 years. I know how to see a pattern. I started writing things down, not in a dramatic way, not in some legal notebook, just in the little spiral pad I keep by the kitchen phone. Date. What was asked. Date. What was offered in return. Over 6 months, I filled up most of that pad, and when I read it back, I felt something I can only describe as the floor dropping out from under me. Not because I was surprised, but because I had been hoping I was wrong, and the notebook proved I wasn't. I had given them, in just under 3 years, somewhere north of $40,000. I had seen my granddaughter 11 times. 11 times in 3 years, and she lived 40 minutes away. I want to say something here to anyone listening who might recognize themselves in this story. Being generous is not the same as being loved. Being useful is not the same as being valued. I confused those things for a very long time, and the confusion cost me. The call that changed everything came on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. My daughter called, which itself was notable, since the Sunday calls had stopped, and her voice had that particular quality that I had come to recognize. Warm, but with something underneath the warmth. The way you heat something in the microwave, and it's hot on the outside, but still cold in the middle. She said that Scott had found a property. A house, actually, a larger house than their current one, in a better school district. They wanted to buy it. The problem was the gap between what they could qualify for and what the house cost. She said, "Mom, we were thinking about your house." I said, "What about it?" She said, "Well, you're in that place alone and it's a lot for one person, and we thought maybe if we worked something out, if you signed it over to us, or even just let us use it as collateral, you could come live with us. We have the basement and we could finish it properly, and you'd be close to the baby." She kept talking. I let her talk. I stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd washed those green beans on Thanksgiving. And I looked at the window above the sink, and outside the window were the tulip bulbs I had planted in October, and they were just starting to come up, red and yellow, the way they came up every year, because Jean had planted them when we first bought this house 31 years ago. I said, "Let me think about it." She seemed surprised. I had never asked for time to think before. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat up with the spiral pad, and I looked at $40,000 in 11 visits, and the green beans, and the Thanksgiving I'd spent alone, watching a movie I didn't even like. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I made a decision. The next day, I called my friend Claudette. She'd gone through her own version of this with her son years back, and she had come out the other side, and she was one of the few people I trusted to be honest with me. Claudette said, "Do not sign anything. Do not put their name on anything. And go see Martin Ellery." Martin Ellery was an elder law attorney in our county seat. I had met him once at a church fundraiser. He had a quiet, methodical way about him, the kind of person who listened without interrupting, and I had thought at the time that he must be good at his job. I made the appointment myself without telling my daughter. I put on my good gray blazer, the one I wear when I mean business, and I drove the 20 miles and sat across from Martin Ellery, and I told him everything: the money, the access, the Thanksgiving call, the basement offer, the house. He listened. He did not look surprised. He had, I suspect, heard some version of this story many times before. He said, "Let's talk about what you want." Nobody had asked me that in quite some time, what I want. I had to sit with it for a moment before I could answer. I said, "I want to stay in my house. I want to see my granddaughter. And I want to stop feeling like an ATM with a grandmother's face." He smiled, just slightly, and said, "Those are all achievable." We talked for an hour and a half. He explained things I didn't know, things I should have known years ago. He explained what signing over a property actually means, and what it does not mean, and what rights I had under the law regardless of what anyone in my family might prefer. He explained the difference between what is legal and what is emotionally coercive, and he gave that difference a name, which helped. He also suggested I update my will. I had not updated it since Jean died. His half had folded into mine automatically, and I'd left everything as it was because changing it felt like another loss, another admission that the life we'd built together was over. But sitting in that office, I understood that the will I had was not protecting me. It was being planned around. I made changes. Careful, deliberate changes that gave me the life I wanted and stopped rewarding behavior that had cost me dearly. I am not going to describe the specifics in the way a person might in a confrontation. I'm not telling this story for drama. I'm telling it because I want you to understand the sequence. I got quiet, I got information, and then I got clear. I called my daughter back 2 weeks after her ask, and I said, "I've thought about it, and I'm going to stay in my house." Silence. Then, "Mom, I'm going to stay in my house," I said again. "I love you. I love that baby. But I am not going to sign over my home." She said that I was being selfish, that I had so much and they had so little, that I clearly didn't care about my granddaughter's future or I wouldn't hesitate. I let her say those things. I had braced for them. What I noticed was how practiced they sounded, like lines from a script that had been run through before. When she finished, I said, "I hope we can find another way forward. My door is open." She hung up. She did not call for 6 weeks. I won't pretend those 6 weeks were easy. I had made the right choice, and I knew I had made the right choice, and I still cried in the car on the way home from the grocery store, twice. And once more in the middle of a Tuesday night, when the house was very quiet, and I thought about my granddaughter growing up 40 minutes away, and maybe never knowing me the way I wanted her to. That grief was real. I don't want to wrap it up too neatly, but here is also what happened in those 6 weeks. I called my cousin Renata, who I had not spoken to properly in 2 years because I had been so focused on being available to my daughter that I'd let everything else fall away. I started going back to my Tuesday morning book group, which I had dropped when my granddaughter was born, because I'd been hoping to be needed for childcare that never came. I had lunch with a woman from my old school who made me laugh until my sides ached over a story about a substitute teacher and a hamster. I had forgotten that my life had a texture outside of waiting. When my daughter finally called, 6 weeks later, her voice was different. The practiced quality was gone. She sounded tired and younger than her age, and for a moment I heard the girl she used to be, calling me from her college dorm because she'd had a hard week and just needed to hear my voice. She said, "Scott and I have been talking." I said, "Okay," she said, "I think things got out of hand. I think we asked too much." I didn't say yes, you did. I didn't say you have no idea. I said, "I think so too." She cried a little, I cried a little. We did not resolve everything in that phone call. There were things I didn't say that still needed to be said. There were patterns that one conversation couldn't undo, but it was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. And honesty, even when it comes late, is still a beginning. I have seen my granddaughters 7 times since then. 7 times in 8 months. That is more than twice the pace of the 3 years before. She is 3 now. She has a dimple in her left cheek that is Jean's dimple, the same one my daughter has. And when she laughs, I can see all the way back to when my daughter was 3. And we lived in the little house on Carnation Street. And Jean used to chase her around the yard while she shrieked with joy. Some things have not changed. My daughter and I are still learning how to be honest with each other. Some conversations are still too careful, still feel like walking on a floor you're not sure will hold. Scott and I are polite, which is not the same as warm, but it is something. My house is still mine. My name is on the deed. My tulips come up every spring. I did not tell my daughter about the appointment with Martin Ellery until almost 4 months after it happened. I wasn't hiding it, exactly. I just needed it to be real for me before I made it real in the space between us. When I told her, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "You were protecting yourself." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't realize you needed to." I said, "I know." Shat was honest. She genuinely hadn't realized. That was the thing that took me the longest to understand. That the harm doesn't require the other person to know they're doing it. It doesn't require malice. It can come from habit, from financial stress, from a husband who sees a resource instead of a mother-in-law, and slowly, imperceptibly, teaches his wife to see it too. I don't know what the next years will look like. I hope they look like Sunday dinners and holidays, and my granddaughter, growing up, knowing that her grandmother has a house with a yard where tulips come up every spring because her great-grandfather planted them. I hope they look like honesty, the kind that's a little uncomfortable sometimes, but that holds. I am not bitter. I want to say that clearly, because this story could sound like bitterness and it isn't. I am something more complicated than bitter. I am a woman who loved her family so much that she made herself invisible to keep the peace. Who finally, at 67, stopped making herself invisible. Who found out that the peace wasn't real anyway, and that the real thing, the harder, more uncertain thing, was worth more. Gene used to say that the most important thing you can do for the people you love is tell them the truth. He was not always good at this himself, to be fair, but he believed it. And I think about it now when I talk to my daughter. I called her last Tuesday just to check in. No occasion, no need, just to hear her voice. She sounded surprised, and then she sounded pleased. And we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Her work, a book I was reading, something funny my granddaughter had said about the dog next door. When we hung up, I sat for a moment at the kitchen table. The afternoon light came in through the window above the sink. The same light that has come in through that window for 31 years, slanting across the same counter, landing on the same dish rack. Some things I will never get back, I know that. But I am still here in my house, in my life, in my own name. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like exactly enough.